We've just had the Tory party conference. This weekend, it's Labour's turn. For Keir Starmer, he begins conference on a high, set firmly, according to the polls, on the path to glory. But are the polls right? There's one question that's haunted Starmer throughout his leadership. What does he actually stand for?
Can you guarantee that under your leadership, the 2019 Labour commitments to nationalise water, energy, rail, the Royal Mail, they'll all be in Labour's next election manifesto?
I've made that commitment.
Given that you've ditched policies such as nationalising energy companies, the policies that you won the Labour leadership on, why should anyone believe anything you say anyway? Thank you.
Beth, look, thank you for that question.
Why not stick to that pledge to increase income tax for the top 5% of earners?
I mean, there are very important pledges I made, the vast majority of which stand.
I do remember a Labour leadership candidate called Keir Starmer pledging to abolish tuition fees just 3 years ago. What happened to that?
Yeah, well, look, huge damage has been done to our economy.
I think he's a bit of a rat. I'm sorry.
A rat? Why do you think a rat?
Because he's ratted on all his promises and his pledges just to get into power.
All of that has allowed Starmer's opponents to frame him like this.
You just cannot know what you're going to get with him. The only thing that is certain is that it won't be what he's promising you.
You're listening to Stories of Our Times from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Manveen Rana. Today, the problem for Keir Starmer.
I'm Patrick Maguire. I'm a columnist for The Times, and I write almost exclusively about the Labour Party and what Keir Starmer and the broader left are up to, and trying to decode the Labour leadership's often quite opaque decisions and strategies.
You'll have a lot to decode during the course of the next week when Labour goes to conference. But before then, you've spent this week at the Tory party conference in Manchester. How has that been?
One really gets a sense that the Conservative Party is sort of knackered. I've been to many Tory conferences, but whereas, say, last year was completely chaotic, Liz Truss's premiership and her policy platform was collapsing in real time around us, this year has just felt like an overwhelming flatness. But the other thing that was striking is, despite all of that, despite the lack of energy, Conservative campaign headquarters, CTHQ and Number 10, are confident as to how they will fight the next election, which is, you can basically sum it up as cars and culture wars.
We will fund the Shipley Bypass, the Blythe Relief Road, and deliver 70 other road schemes. Now, I'm confident that once flights start going regularly to Rwanda, the boats will stop coming. In too many parts of our permanent state, virtue signalling has replaced common sense. And we shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense. Never let anyone tell you that this is a racist country. It is not.
That seems to be the strategy that the Conservative Party is heading into the next election in, plus the economy.
You can't borrow your way out of inflation.
And, there's been a really interesting disconnect between the sort of certitude of that message on the main stage, but the sort of total lack of even really the meaningful sort of arguments on the fringe that we've seen before. Even Liz Truss.
Are you just here to cause trouble? Liz? Is Rishi Sunak getting it wrong?
Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Liz Truss.
She packed out the room, but there's just a sense of a party that's preparing for opposition. Thank you. Or, at the very most, trying to get its core vote out.
Let's be prepared to make Conservative arguments again, even if it's unpopular, even if it's difficult. I want everybody in this room to unleash their inner Conservative.
They did also have Nigel Farage dancing, singing very loudly with Priti Patel. I mean, I'm not sure what Labour can do to compete with that.
No, that's unmatchable.
What are you doing here? Is this your party now?
No.
How are we? All right.
Can we take a selfie?
Yeah, come on then.
Nigel Farage's presence reminds me almost of Labour politics under Jeremy Corbyn to a certain extent, where you have the ideological fringe of the party's movement moving into the mainstream, and that's been very visible at conference, right? You've had Nigel Farage sat applauding Liz Truss.
This is the Great British Growth Rally starring Liz Truss. They will not get everybody into the room. There is a genuine buzz here. I've got to tell you, this is more exciting than anything happening in the conference hall.
It reminds me of when Hugh Gateskill gave his speech in 1961 saying that joining the EEC, what became the EU, would be the end of 1,000 years of history, the end of Britain as a sovereign nation.
For we are not just a part of Europe. If this is the idea, the end of Britain as an independent nation state, I make no apology for repeating it, the end of 1,000 years of history.
He got a huge round of applause from the conference hall, but his wife Dora turned to him and said, all the wrong people are clapping. And I imagine that's how some Tories will think, looking at Liz Truss and seeing some of the people who were in Manchester. So yeah, it's been really striking. And I think there'll be a marked contrast in Liverpool from what we saw in Manchester, because Keir Starmer's conference will be very tightly stave managed. There'll be no room for dissent from the left in the way there has been from the hard right of the Conservative Party at this conference.
Patrick, there aren't many people who would watch Liz Truss and think of Hugh Gateskill, and that's why we love having you on. But, you know, as you say, Labour will have a very strict regime on messaging over the next week. They are going into this conference. You know, they've been riding high for a while now. They're doing spectacularly well in the polls. Every poll seems to have them trouncing the Tories at the next election. The Times, in fact, had a poll last week which predicted that 6 cabinet ministers would lose their seats at the next election. That includes the Chancellor and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and that Labour would win a majority of 90 seats. However, earlier this week, there was one poll, and I know it's only one poll, but there was one poll that showed the Labour lead had been cut to just 10 points. And a lot of people predict that, you know, the lead will certainly narrow as the election comes closer. How do you think that'll affect Keir Starmer going into this conference? Will that poll have mattered?
Well, look, it certainly mattered to a number of Tory MPs and ministers I spoke to in Manchester who were celebrating that poll as if it was an election victory.
I mean, it still has them losing.
Well, no, exactly, but it's a sign to some in CCHQ who've convinced themselves that their strategy is working. It's always unwise to draw conclusions out of one poll, but that's certainly given the Tories a bit of a fillip. But yeah, you're absolutely right. As one shadow cabinet minister said to me on the phone about 15 minutes ago, just before we spoke, sometimes it feels as if the Labour Party has more faith in the Conservatives' ability to win the next election than it does. And I'd say that's something that is playing into conference preparations. I mean, earlier this week in the Times, I was reporting there's a bit of a struggle going on over what Keir Starmer should say in his speech and whom he should say it to, because the only 2 conferences he had as leader have been about demonstrating the party has changed and changing the party. This conference, 2023, is more difficult for Keir Starmer. And when I speak to the people around him, I say, what's the point of this conference? They say, look, we need to answer the question, if not them, why us? That's a very, very difficult question for a leader who has primarily defined himself in the negative, be that against Jeremy Corbyn or against Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. It's a different gear for Keir Starmer to do politics in, and we're going to see whether he can rise to that challenge.
And Patrick, another big finding from the Times poll last week was that, as things stand, neither candidate for number 10 has won the overwhelming personal support of voters. You know, nearly half, so 48%, picked neither as their preferred leader. Starmer certainly came second with 32%, while Sunak only had 19% support. And, you know, 48% of voters say that Starmer doesn't look like a prime minister in waiting. Now, that is a lot of people he's got to win round. How is he going about showing that he is prime ministerial material?
The one thing Keir Starmer does have to his advantage is he, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, is prepared to do the things Labour leaders are conventionally expected to do in order to overcome some of the hang-ups people traditionally have about the Labour Party, right? So singing the national anthem last year, embracing without embarrassment the traditions of the country he aspires to govern is a big one. He's been on international tours of late, so he's doing the statesman thing that often you're only able to do if foreign governments think you are an incoming Prime Minister, so he went to meet President Macron at the Elysee. I'm sure he'll go to Washington at some point before the next election too. But the interesting thing is about all those polls, and indeed the very question Labour people are trying to answer, if not them, why us? The funny thing about the British electoral system is if the first half of that question is really settled, the if not them bit, in a way it doesn't matter so much if voters are unconvinced by Keir Starmer. I mean, somebody at the top of the Labour Party said to me recently, our voter research on Keir is often middling to bad, but the saving grace is that they really, really dislike the Conservatives at the moment. If that changes, though, if Rishi Sunak's new strategy does pay dividends, most people say it's unlikely that it will, but there's no suggestion that it's impossible, then that's where all of those polls that show people are underwhelmed and slightly nonplussed about Keir Starmer will come to matter.
So Labour really can't rely on winning by default. They're going into this conference, and it could be the last one before the next election. This could be Keir Starmer's big moment to tell people who he is without other people defining him, to try and show why people should vote for him and not just not vote for Rishi Sunak. A lot of that will come down to his big conference speech. How is speech writing going?
I wrote in the Times recently that the speech was a bit of a struggle, to which lots of Labour people got in touch with me and said, not quite denying what I'd written, but saying, it's always a struggle at this stage. But it's made more difficult by the fact that this is the first time Keir Starmer has had to get up in front of the country, and the onus is really on him not to deconstruct Tory failures, but to set out what the point of Keir Starmer is. That's something he hasn't really done thus far. So it's going to be difficult for him. And I think some people on the inside are feeling the heat ever so slightly. What will he say? What might he say? Something I picked up is he's done the I'm the son of a toolmaker and a nurse thing to death. I think he's actually going to joke that people are sick of hearing that. I think he's likely to reveal a little bit more about the family he's raising himself, not the family he grew up in. And a key word that keeps recurring in my conversations is the word respect. Now, respect is a word that won elections for unfashionable centre-left parties in Germany.
Es geht uns.
Olaf Scholz, another sort of slightly underwhelming leader.
Aus Respekt für dich. Mit Kompetenz für Deutschland.
Anthony Albanese in Australia.
Respect and dignity.
And also the Norwegian Social Democrats all won on a strategy of saying, look, we respect your cultural values of our traditional voters that we may have lost in the past, and also we respect the struggles you're going through in your economic circumstances. So I think we're going to hear Keir Starmer talk about the notion of respect for the voters, i.e. knowing that, in his view, the Conservatives have sort of ushered in a new age of disenchantment with the political process. I think we'd like to hear Keir Starmer sort of try and make a moral and principled case for politics as a force for change. And that speaks volumes about who Keir Starmer is. He identifies as a sort of upwardly mobile working class boy who both his family and himself have always felt a degree of middle class condescension, and he feels that in some ways is the story of this country's politics, that people don't feel they're respected by those in power, and it's his job as leader of the Labour Party to demonstrate that respect.
You've written, though, that he also needs to talk about hope. I mean, just talk us through that.
Yeah, well, it's not enough to say, things are terrible. We get it. The voters know things are terrible. That's part of the reason they've turned against the government. Hope is the other key element, and that has been the tricky thing about some of Labour's messaging to date. They've been hidebound by their own fiscal rules and push for credibility on the economy, which can mean sometimes Keir Starmer and his shadow cabinet spokespeople can sound really fatalistic about the state of the economy and the point of electing a Labour government. Take Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor.
It's our monthly phone-in with Labour Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Let's go to Helena, who's a first-time caller in Nottingham.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Helena.
Hi, I've got a quote here from a pretty prominent economist, and they say that Labour needs to provide an alternative to aggressive policies being prioritised by the Conservatives. The banks and those earning more than £100,000 could quite easily contribute a little more, and unless they do, inequality and poverty will inevitably soar in the months and years ahead. Do you agree with that statement?
The way that I believe that you can reduce poverty is through growing the economy.
You know the economist that she quoted? That was actually you.
Well, look, I mean, I want to reduce poverty, but how do you do that? What are the practical things that we can do?
Well, your suggestion in that quote was to tax the banks more and those earning more than £100,000 more, but you've gone back on that.
Lots of her colleagues are guilty of the same thing. Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary, when she was questioned about the wrapped concrete in schools and what Labour would do to fix it, she said,
I can't wave a magic wand and put right 13 years of
Well, that's not my question.
failure.
What would you like to do?
Could.
Would you commit to paying for a full school rebuilding programme if you win the election? Because that's what you're criticising them for, cancelling it and not doing it. Why not commit to it right now?
Because, we would face a really difficult situation around the economy. You heard from Jeremy Hunt, there's basically no growth in the economy. The public finance...
I won't have a magic wand. If you're a voter, you can understand why that's a slightly demoralising message. So Keir Starmer has to walk that very difficult tightrope of saying, yes, I recognise that you are inherently suspicious of politicians promising to fix things now, but this is how the Labour Party is going to do it. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, you don't want to show you're promising things you couldn't possibly meet. At the same time, nobody's going to vote Labour expecting more of the same.
No, exactly, and that's the difficult thing.
Patrick, in terms of, what Keir Starmer's worldview is, really, where he stands on most things, I'm going to fall back on your encyclopedic knowledge of political history, because there is a particular speech by Tony Benn from 1990, which almost nobody heard at the time, speaking to an empty chamber, and very few people would be able to remember now. Luckily, you're not one of them. So tell us about this speech and why you think it correlates with Keir Starmer's view of the world.
Well, it's interesting in that, so Tony Benn was a big idol, as he was for many young lefties in the 1980s, of Keir Starmer's.
We've tried to make capitalism work with good and humane Labour governments, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work.
By 1990, he'd unsuccessfully challenged Neil Kinnock for the Labour leadership and was basically in irrelevance, but he was still an amazing parliamentary speaker. Even those who opposed him would admit that.
I was once the most dangerous man in Britain, and now I'm described as a national treasure.
He sort of had a messianic zeal about the way he spoke.
I tried to speak my mind, and that's what you have to do in politics.
After the fall of Margaret Thatcher, he spoke in a debate on the Thatcher government and its fall, and it's really sad that I'm able to quote this off the top of my head, but he was...
I mean, Patrick, you say sad. I'd say impressive.
He was critiquing, after 11 years in power, the country Mrs. Thatcher had built, and there's a line that has always stuck with me, particularly given Keir Starmer's biography, in which Tony Benn says, you talk to people who dig coal,
ran train, doctors, nurses, dentists, tool makers. Nobody in Britain is interested in them.
Nobody in Britain is interested in them.
This is a country today that has an utter contempt for skill.
Now that is sort of Keir Starmer's worldview in a nutshell. Thinking back to Rodney Starmer, the toolmaker, his dad, the victim of middle-class condescension and snobbery in the Surrey commuter belt town where they lived. He's one of 4 children. He's the only one who went to university. He has siblings who work in engineering and care or whatever. So he gets that instinctively. But there's a line after Tony Benn talks about toolmakers. He says,
the whole of this so-called entrepreneurial society has focused on the city news we get in every bulletin, telling us what's happened to the pound sterling to
3 points of decimals. And he says,
skill is what built this country's strength, and it is treated with contempt.
Skill is what built this country's strength, and it's treated with contempt. The issue there is, Keir Starmer believes both those things at once. Tony Benn was deploring the city and business deciding what was important in politics or what politicians could do. So Keir Starmer would disagree with the idea that credibility in the eyes of the city is something to be deplored, as Tony Benn thinks. And so it's an interesting paradox there, and it shows you, I think that speech, those 2 lines in particular, to me, summed up the difficulty Keir Starmer is going to have, indeed any Labour leader is going to have, in reassuring the country, one, that it recognises the scale of the challenges before them, and two, can fix them in a sort of fiscally credible way that's not going to panic the markets in the way that Liz Truss did this time last year.
And in terms of treading that line, I think a lot of people, as you say, he's got to communicate this to the voters. He's got to give them a sense that he respects them, that there is some hope too for the future. Most voters, though, at the moment would probably say they don't really know what Keir Starmer stands for. There's talk of flip-flopping. What does he actually want to achieve with being a number 10?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned flip-flopping, having just come from the Tory party conference where for $16.99 you could buy a pair of flip-flops with Keir Starmer's face on them.
Now, there's a gag we knew would be coming.
Yeah, exactly. But, it's interesting, right? I speak to Labour people all the time. I speak to Conservative people all the time. I actually bumped into, late one night at Tory conference, a very senior Conservative strategist, and their perspective on this was that Keir Starmer was their greatest asset, precisely because he has taken lots and lots of positions in a very short space of time that contradict each other, and voters sort of have an instinctive feel for that. And the challenge for Keir Starmer is that he has to be able to tell voters why he has changed his mind, and do so in that doesn't just say, I once believed we could do lots of good things, but now the economy's broken, so we can't do anything that's very good. Voters don't want to hear that. But, what is the story he wants to tell? What's he want to do with power? I think he'll want to change the state in all kind of ways. He wants to bring in a new Race Equality Act, right? It's clear also that he wants to rewire Whitehall to make tackling the climate crisis more central to it, with a new department for Ed Miliband or whatever. That is all sort of the blue sky thinking that sort of animates Keir Starmer. The difficulty is the Labour Party is going to inherit a state that's in total crisis, and a treasury that's in total crisis. And there's an awareness at the top of the Labour Party that the first term of the Labour government is essentially going to be a prolonged exercise in firefighting, and they may well not be able to do any of the big structural changes to the state they want to make. I mean, the thing that people tell me really animates Keir Starmer is housing. That is also key to Labour's economic policy, right? The idea that the planning system is sort of got this country's economy in a chokehold. If you can make building houses easier, particularly in the southeast, that could be potentially transformative economically. And Keir Starmer is known to quote something Clement Attlee used to say to his team, which is something like, well, look, they can vote me out, but they won't be able to knock the houses down. So I think, that's the key one. And I think that's the thing Labour might be able to do quickest, actually.
So that's some of the priorities he'll probably end up talking about. Talk us through some of the people we're likely to see at conference, because you've described how at Tory party conference this week it's felt sort of flat, it's felt tired. Are you expecting a huge influx of businesses, for example, turning up at Labour? Is there a sense of, power sort of switching? And who are the people who will really influence Starmer? Is this a return of the Blairites?
I think this is the first year in a very long time that business interest in Labour conference has outstripped that in Tory conference. There are more businesses setting up stalls at the Labour conference than are doing at Tory conference, because this is all a great opportunity for...
That's always a sign, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. For lobbyists and businesses to, even if it's 2 minutes at a cocktail party with a shadow minister, this sort of stuff really matters. So businesses will be taking a keen interest. The sort of key speeches we'll hear beyond Keir Starmer, obviously Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. I did have it suggested to me, I wrote this in the Times, that we might hear her tentatively, carefully make an argument that's hitherto been judged too risky to make, which is that a Labour government would, borrow to invest, to build big infrastructure projects to get a return on economic growth. So that's something to watch out for.
That would be quite the mirror image of Tory party conference cancelling HS2.
Yeah, exactly. Whether Rachel Reeves makes that argument, which I believe she will, and how she makes it, crucially, will be a really interesting measure of just how confident the Labour Party is. As for the Blairites, I'm told Tony Blair is not coming to Labour conference. I think Tony Blair knows that if he turned up at Labour conference, it would be an enormous circus.
Will the Tony Blair Institute be there?
The Tony Blair Institute will be there in force, yeah. I mean, the expectation among some Labour people, said with varying degrees of resentment and cynicism, that the Tony Blair Institute's many policy advisors will immediately be hired by a Labour government. I think that's slightly overdone, but the Tony Blair Institute are a one-stop policy shop. Tony Blair is taking a much closer interest in the politics of the Labour Party than he has for a very long time. And look, 2 years ago, Tony Blair was wondering whether the answer to Britain's woes was for him to return to frontline politics. Now, 2 years on, despite his well-known reservations about Keir Starmer, you've got Tony Blair basically anointing him as his chosen successor, and Keir Starmer taking that endorsement. But, you know, the biggest vindication of the influence of Blairites and Blairism will be the shadow cabinet ministers who speak from the stage. You know, the likes of Liz Kendall, whose Blairite politics was so unpopular in 2015 when she ran to replace Ed Miliband that she won 4.5% of the vote. That will be the most profound illustration of how the Labour Party has changed.
Is there a tension between what Keir Starmer will be hearing from the polling? He can see he needs to provide hope, he needs to be bolder. At the same time, a lot of Blairites will be telling him to play it safe. You know, we keep hearing the analogy about a Ming vase.
Oh, God, the Ming vase analogy is one I'm
Talk us through that.
already sick of. Well, it's something Roy Jenkins said, which is, Roy Jenkins, you know, a great hero of Tony Blair's, former Labour cabinet minister, later founded the SDP. He compared a Labour Prime Minister approaching power as a man trying to carry a Ming vase, a priceless Ming vase, across a newly polished marble floor. I.e., if you attempt to do anything other than walk very, very gingerly and slowly towards the podium you need to put that Ming vase on, you are going to drop the priceless Ming vase and end up humiliated and desolate. And so that's an analogy that has a lot of purchase. The problem with that analogy is it's very difficult to square with a Keir Starmer who in the past 2 weeks has been speaking very openly about a closer relationship with Europe, which is a risky thing for Keir Starmer, the former Remainer-in-Chief of the Labour Party, to do. Ditto leaning into migration. You know, there's an appetite among some of his aides to let's have these difficult conversations now, lest they derail our election campaign. So I don't think we're quite in Ming vase mode anymore. And I think what unites the entire Labour Party is a desire for Keir Starmer to answer the big question. If not them, why us?
You've been listening to Stories of Our Times, a podcast brought to you thanks to the subscribers of The Times and The Sunday Times, with me, Manveen Rana, and my guest, Times columnist and Times Radio senior political correspondent, Patrick Maguire. You can follow full coverage of the Labour Party conference with our brilliant politics team, both on Times Radio and online with a subscription to the paper. The producer was James Shield, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and today's episode was mixed by Hannah Farrell. If you'd like to suggest any stories you'd like us to cover, then please do drop us a line at storiesofourtimes@thetimes.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Have a lovely weekend.